What do you think is going on in these frames? This is a covert FBI shoot. On it, a Russian illegal agent is looking for a place in a designated hiding place. Then he hides the object. It seems to be disguised as a newspaper parcel. The same thing was done by Tracy Leon Foley's cable car until it was declassified. The end of our career in intelligence was laid when FBI agents knocked on our door and, in front of our already grown-up children, we could say, handcuffed us and took us to waiting buses that were on the street. As a result of the betrayal, our activities became known to the Americans, and we were arrested. We are Tracy and her husband, Donald Heathfeld. And now in order, imagine the 2000th USA and an unremarkable family from Canada. She is a real estate agent and a loving mom. He is a manager in a consulting company. Its customers, governments and large corporations. But the couple has a secret. Back in the 80s, they were recruited by the Soviet KGB, and the real names of the scouts are Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova. In the 2010 year, the Americans became aware of this.
The people arrested in the United States in the case of espionage in favor of Russia are citizens of our country. All the detainees were illegal agents who performed long-term tasks under deep cover in favor of Russia.
For 23 years, this married couple lived in different countries and under different names. But where is the beginning of this story? How did Elena Vavilova turn into Tracy Len Foley? I was born in Tomsk, in a Siberian city, a beautiful student city where my parents lived, my grandparents in general. I am a native Tomichka. As they say, we have a school and a university in our youth years. And I came to the intelligence service also by chance. We can say, specifically, the offer to start training for work just here in the position of an illegal intelligence officer. In general, it was made one day when I was studying in the third year, and also in an atmosphere of secrecy. In a safe house at that moment, I was in a relationship with a certain Andrei, also a student of historical faculty. And I was told that he also agreed to go into intelligence. Weddings and relocation were arranged in a hurry. My parents were told that we had been invited to work in the sociology department in Moscow. After moving to Moscow, training began surveillance encryption Morse code. There were shooting classes because we both became officers, and in general, well, our training implied weapons skills. And there was karate again, in order for us to be in good physical shape and have self-defense skills. And we had to master French first, then add English, bring both languages to that level of native, or almost native, because this is the key to calm and successful work. Often in language classes, we had to portray a French woman, then an English woman, then a rope, one of the first lessons. We learned how to count correctly on our fingers. For the most part, foreigners unbend their fingers when counting, while Russians bend them. And in the Soviet Union, it was very difficult to prepare a person to work abroad because the West for us was in general such a very incomprehensible world. We could not communicate with foreigners. We did not have the opportunity to go somewhere. So initially we studied both the way of life and the mentality of foreigners through the language with the perception of culture, and, above all, through films. And we had a period when we were brought for a while to live in one house in the suburbs of Moscow, which was equipped with all the equipment that came from the West. There was a video recorder, turntables, a coffee maker, a toaster, and we had to feel like residents of some Western city. Clothes are also a separate conversation, because there was a separate problem. There was nothing to have clothes that were produced in the Soviet Union. In general, any items that surrounded us, we could not take with us when we were already going to work. And we had organized for us specifically such a trip to West Berlin.
Вообще любые предметы, которые нас окружали, мы не могли с собой взять, когда мы выезжали уже на работу. И у нас была организована для нас специально такая поездка, выезд в Западный Берлин.
At that time, Germany was still divided, but after arriving in East Berlin, we were taken to West Berlin for a day for one day, and we had to buy all the equipment in one department store, as we called it, in general, buy ourselves clothes that would be enough for us for some period. Here is the initial period, until we get used to it, and get there already to a permanent place of residence, and there we will start buying things from local stores. I remember there was also a knitted sweater and a blue jacket that I wore, but for us, of course, it was also a peculiar experience because we found ourselves in a completely different store that was not like our Soviet ones, where we could safely touch things to measure, and no one was watching us. And in general, this, of course, was also a novelty for us.
Of all the places that have recently brought journalists to publicity, this was and remains the most secret so far.
The first time a scout starts working, of course, he has such a rather limited legend, and of course it was necessary to imagine for yourself where you lived, what friends you had as a child, to imagine your school, something we had to specifically find at the addresses. Go to these places to see if there is a school. Maybe it's not there anymore, and this would be the best option when you could say that you studied there, and then it was disbanded or it was redone. In general, so that there would be no, let's say, no binding already to this place, but nevertheless, it was necessary to study at least the street approaches, some interesting architectural details of the place where you spent your childhood. It was the beginning of the legend. Then it already began to acquire some specific elements that we already lived in. Moreover, we started our work separately, and we even entered Canada in different places and at different times. In order to protect each other, of course. And then, when we had each of us settled separately, we began to create a legend of our acquaintance. It is already possible to say not even a legend, but a more truthful story, so that it is clear that we first met. Then we decided to get married, and our family was already formed in this way. Well, we can say in front of our several friends who were at that time. And here is a photo from the second wedding of Elena Vavilova and Andrei Bezrukov, or rather, the wedding of Tracy and Donald, native Canadians. I had the name Tracy Lee and Foley. These are three names, and the surname Foley. And my spouse had the name Donald Howard Hisfield, two first names and a surname, and we did not choose these names, they were given to us. There was a system in Canada when death and birth were not combined into one database. It helped, and our special services used it, not an isolated case. It is already a classic of our intelligence that they assign the names of doubles. That is, we played the role of really born babies, but who did not live long. In general, then, they died. But the task was to get used to the society as quickly as possible, where we had to work, get certain documents that we naturally lacked, and then, well, start getting acquainted with neighbors to look for work. This was also important, because it was impossible to just live without explaining what money you live on. At first the center helps, and then this task we have to provide for ourselves. in order to keep this super secret, so that no one would guess that you have some kind of second double life.
Это задача нас самих обеспечивать себя для того, чтобы как раз сохранить вот эту суперсекретность, чтобы никто не догадывался, что у тебя есть какая-то вторая двойная жизнь.
The most important thing for a scout is to be able to explain some inconsistencies in his legend, perhaps some details of appearance. Well, for example, we had a smallpox scar that was quite visible while the Canadians or the West already made it more carefully, and not on the outside of the hand.
На Западе уже делали его более аккуратно и не на внешней стороне руки.
What was to be done in this case? It was necessary to come up with an explanation for this. The same thing, for example, with fillings that we had for a long time amalgams. These are dark fillings, and in the West they have been doing light white ones for a long time, which were not visible. The main thing is to find the right explanation. And in my case, I said that I lived with my parents as a child in an African country where dental materials were not so good, and now it so happened that I had so many fillings that did not seem light. And the same thing with sham, that I was vaccinated in this way. And my parents did not watch so much about it, we told and retold to other people. We began to believe in it ourselves, and such a transformation took place.
Столько об этом рассказывали, пересказывали другим людям, мы стали верить в это сами. И произошла такая вот трансформация.
This legend itself was becoming reality itself somehow. The couple lived in Canada for several years. During this time, they received higher education and started working. Tracy and Donald even started a diaper company. Here is an article about this business in a local newspaper in Canada. The couple's sons Alex and Tim were also born. Then, when we moved to France, before we moved, we sold our business, and this allowed others to explain, and we ourselves have enough funds to pay for our studies at the next university. Moreover, we had to indicate in our financial statements, which we made and sent in encryption, how much we earned, and all the earned funds, they generally belonged to our state of Russia. We could not even in our reports in general, we could not use all of everything that we earned even for ourselves. This kind of rule that had to be observed so that a person would not get carried away with making money. And we were given a certain amount in return, which, well, was considered our salary.
Была положена определенная сумма, которая, как считалась нашей зарплатой.
In the States, the family settled in Cambridge. For all new acquaintances, they were an example of the fulfillment of the American dream, immigrants who have achieved great success. In the assignments, of course, I can't tell because it would be a violation of the rules of secrecy in intelligence and in general. I have no right. I can say in general that yes. We studied several people to recruit for our intelligence. There were cases when we needed to understand and find out if a person is a representative of the special services. Already, for example, there were such tasks for the American special services, but basically we were looking for information ourselves and purposefully went to where it could be, and these are always people. Therefore, we sought to be just effective in finding those people who influence the formation of US policy. And that is why our focus was on some kind of university, an educational institution in which these people could be, and Harvard University became such a university. And in the end, in general, this plan turned out to be well, effective, and interesting from the point of view of implementation, and just reaching out to those people who, by the way, some of them are still shaping the policy of the United States. The main goal of Russian intelligence officers abroad is to communicate with high-ranking people. It is such contacts that can give important information for the country. For example, one of Donald's classmates is the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon. Of course, intelligence always has a certain center that coordinates tasks for all intelligence officers and those people who work, for example, in Latin America. They can also receive tasks to collect information related to American politics. And there should be no connection between people who work under such covers. This is a guarantee that they will all be safe, and no one will be able to impose as if to endanger another person. Therefore, there is never such a connection between illegals. And that's right. It just helps to work calmly, realizing that no one can give you away. Well, except for betrayals, which has already been found, as they say, in another place. Take a look at this picture. It was published by the FBI during the investigation. In these images, Richard Murphy, one of the Russian intelligence officers, encrypted the messages. And here are the negatives found by the FBI in a hiding place in Boston. The information on them is secret, so it is covered with black, followed by a secret letter. Here is another curious find of a 27-digit password. In fact, the fewer spy gadgets and devices you have, the calmer, the better. Therefore, they tried not to load us with these various tools. We had a radio, and the radio looked like a completely ordinary household radio. We had small cipher notebooks that also did not look like something special. And perhaps all of us did not have any special equipment, just to preserve, protect us from any suspicious moments. The US Federal Bureau of Investigation has been monitoring Russian illegal agents for a long time. Their specialists have collected evidence of the direct transfer of classified data. A traitor in the Russian rear revealed hiding places where hidden cameras were later installed by the Americans. For example, Michael Zatoli takes a package from a secret place. We could pick up caches and send this information to someone, and we could give us a place that was designated for the cache. Some kind of container is always used, where paper media or some information is laid. Well, for example, an ordinary brick or stone in general, the object should be so unsightly. Or another such classic one, probably an example, is a can of Coca-Cola, and then a certain place is laid. The main thing is that it is not well. Somewhere not everyone has on the view must be hidden. And this place is described further by the person who lays, does it first, then sets a signal, a sign gives a sign, that the container is there in place, and we are already going to another time, at a certain hour or day too, and we take it from there. And there was even such an interesting case when we had a container in a park area, and we went there with the children. And in general it depicts that with the children we are digging in the ground there, showing them something, looking for it. At the same time one parent is covering, and the other is digging in a certain place, and took out the container already, which was there.
который находился там.
Well,
В
in
общем,
general,
использовали
we used an ordinary
обычную
household
бытовую
such a
такую
scene
сцену
in
для
order to
того, чтобы
complete the
выполнить
task
вот
here. The
задание.
children of Russian
Без русских
intelligence
разведчиков
officers
не
did not
подозревали,
suspect
кто
who
их
their
родители на
parents
самом
were.
деле.
In fact,
Они никогда
they
не
had never
встречались с
met
родственниками
relatives
и
and
считали себя
considered
канадцами.
themselves Canadians. Of
Безусловно,
course,
нельзя было
it was
рассказать
impossible to tell my
ни
parents or
родителям,
even my
ни даже
closest
ближайшим
relatives about what
родственникам,
we were doing.
родственникам о том, чем мы занимались.
They had
Для
their
них
own
была своя
legend according
легенда.
to this
По
legend.
этой
We were
легенде мы были
translators and worked in
переводчиками и
different
работали
organizations. Of
в разных
course, it was
организациях.
possible to
Конечно,
come on vacation
возможность
from
была
time to time,
приезжать
and
в
we came
отпуск
one by
время от
one.
времени.
Then
И то
I,
одному,
then my
то я, то
husband,
супруг
and visited
приезжали
my
и навещали
parents.
родителей.
But this, of
Но
course, was a
конечно, было
problem
проблемой,
because it was
потому
difficult
что
for the parents
трудно
themselves
было и
to
самим
probably live
родителям,
for many
наверное,
years
жить долгие
without
годы,
being
не
able
имея
to communicate
возможности
directly with us.
общаться напрямую с нами.
I had to
Пришлось объяснять,
explain
что
that
мы
we work
работаем в
in an
организации,
organization that does
которая не
not welcome
приветствует
frequent
частое
communication
общение
and the
и
birth of a
рождение
son,
сына, и
and the
то,
way
как
we
мы
named the first
назвали
son, then the
первого сына,
second.
потом второго.
All our
Это все
parents received
наши
a
родители
telegram from
получали
our colleagues from
телеграмму
Moscow. We reported
от наших
accordingly
коллег
in
уже из
encryption
Москвы.
that a boy
Они
was born
сообщили,
on some
соответственно, в
date. They called
шифровке,
him
что
Alexander in
такой-то
Russian.
числа
Not
родился
Russian. Russians talked and
мальчик,
tried to
назвали его
avoid even
Александр.
Russian-speaking people around us. There was such an
Русский
interesting
не
episode
говорили
when our
и
sons got
старались избегать
carried
даже
away with video
русскоязычных
games.
людей
And there
вокруг
was
них.
such a
Был такой
game,
интересный
but it
эпизод,
still
когда
exists, quite famous
наши
Call of
сыновья
Duty.
увлеклись
And there was an
видеоиграми,
episode, in my
и
opinion, there
была
were
такая
Russians
игра, она
and
и сейчас
locals in
есть, довольно
Afghanistan.
известная, Call of
So they
Duty,
thought they played
и
for the
там был
Russians.
эпизод,
And when the game ended,
значит,
and they
в
won as if the
Афганистане
one who
происходило
won
дело,
sounds for
и
him. The
русские,
anthem
и
sounds for
англичане,
them,
значит,
and
вот
the
они
anthem of the
воевали,
Soviet
они играли
Union
за Русь.
sounded in our
И
house,
когда
imagine.
игра
The children
закончилась, и
playing in
они
a big
победили,
room. And suddenly we hear
в
clearly in the
качестве,
kitchen the
значит,
spouse
как будто кто
probably in his
победил,
office hears the anthem of the Soviet
звучит
Union
для
for the
него и для
wrong
них
reason,
звучит
playing
гимн.
loudly in our
И
house.
зазвучал
Well,
гимн
and
Советского
in
Союза в
general,
нашем
they
доме.
did not react
Представляете,
in any way,
наши
of
дети
course, to
играют
this. Well,
в
it
большой
sounded, it
комнате, и
sounded.
вдруг мы
And it
слышим
was even
явно
interesting that
кухни,
during these
супруг мой
games our children
очень
repeated
гневно
some
слышит
words.
гимн Советского Союза, ни с того ни с сего громко играет в нашем доме. Ну и, в общем-то, никак не отреагировали, конечно, на это. Ну, прозвучало, вот. И даже было интересно, что во время вот этих игр наши дети некоторые слова повторяли. Ну,
Well,
такие
such
простые, там,
simple ones
привет,
there, hello,
давай,
come on, or
да,
yes,
нет,
no.
вот такие.
These are the
Причем они это
ones, and
произносили,
they
естественно, с
pronounced it
акцентом.
naturally with an accent. The
В
family
семье
of
нелегальных
illegal
агентов
agents has
прожил в
lived in the
Штатах более
States
10
for
лет.
more than 10 years. The last years
Последние
in
годы в Камбодже.
Cambridge,
Они
they
жили в
lived
этом
in this house. The FBI arrested
Сотрудники
Elena
ФБР
Vavilova
арестовали Елену
and
Вавилову и
Andrei
Андрея
Bezrukov
Безрукова
on June
27 июня
27,
2010
2010 year, the
Первую ночь
first
мы
night we
провели
spent at the
в
police station.
полицейском, я
I
провела в
spent at the
полицейском
police
участке, не знала,
station.
где был
I
муж.
didn't know where my
И
husband
потом мы
was. And
встретились
then
на
we
следующий
met the
день
next day in the
уже
courtroom.
в зале суда.
And
И что интересно,
interestingly,
мы
we were
в
waiting for the
ожидании вот
entrance to the
входа уже
meeting room itself. We met, and when
сам
I saw
зал
him,
заседания,
he was
мы
smiling, and I came
увиделись.
out
И
like
когда я
this
его
in
увидела,
general,
он
in such a sad mood. And
улыбался.
suddenly
А
I
я
see
вышла
him
такая
standing there
достаточно,
smiling,
в
very
общем, таком
optimistic. He
грустном
had a mood,
настроении. И
and
вдруг
really
вижу,
it
он
helped
стоит,
me to
улыбается.
cheer
Очень
up a
такой
little bit. And here he is, that's
оптимистический у
probably
него был
inflexible.
настрой.
Well,
И
some kind of
действительно,
inner
это
will,
помогло мне
strength,
немножко как
she
бы
also
воспрять
helped
дух.
him. And he
И
already
вот его
began to
такая
discuss
вот
specifically
несгибаемая,
which lawyer
наверное,
we
ну
would
какая-то
use, what we
внутренняя
need
воля,
to do,
сила, она
and how
тоже
we need to
ему
give
помогала. И
instructions
он
to
уже стал
children.
обсуждать конкретно, какого адвоката мы будем использовать, что нам нужно сделать и как нам нужно какие дать наставления детям.
We
Мы
entered the
вошли в зал
courtroom,
суда, и наши
and our
дети
children
были
were
там.
there,
И
and I
я успела
managed to
буквально
say
несколько
literally a
фраз им
few
сказать
phrases to
на
them in
французском языке,
French,
чтобы
so
они
that
все
not
поняли,
everyone
куда уезжать,
understood.
потому
They
что мы
said
хотим,
leave
чтобы они
because we didn't
оставались
want them to stay
в
in the
городе
city under siege
под
by
осадой вот
journalists and helicopters around.
журналистов
And then we
и
told them
вертолетов
that, in my
вокруг.
opinion, I said the
И потом мы
phrase,
им
that
сказали,
this betrayal is not
что,
think that we
по-моему, я
did
сказала
something
фразу, что
wrong.
это
But they, of
предательство, не
course,
думайте,
did
что
not
мы
understand
что-то
any of
сделали
this
не
because
так.
they did
Ну,
not know at
наверное, что
all
не
what we were
понимали ничего
doing.
этого,
But it
потому что
was
они не знали
interesting with my
вообще,
husband that
чем
he
мы
was very
занимались.
like this,
Но
and
с
he
мужем было
later
интересно,
admitted
вот он
that
был
he
очень
was, he
таком,
believed that
и
he
он
would
потом
exchange us
признался,
one
что он
day,
был
even in 5 5 years, and that our main task now is to go through a trial, the process.
через 5 лет, и что наша главная задача сейчас пройти вот судебный процесс.
The punishment was serious for the charges that we were charged with. In general, It was assumed that up to 35 years in prison because there were several charges of working for a foreign state, espionage, money laundering. In general, only 35 years were summed up. Who betrayed you? And the traitor turned out to be a man who knew us and our colleagues, which is why our whole group turned out to be arrested in general. He worked at the center in Moscow and at some point switched sides with the American. He probably knew everyone who was working in the United States of America at that time because he had, in general, access to all our documents in Moscow. And what concerns even the arrest and possible interrogations, suspicions. All this was worked out, thought out, and we even had a planned escape route from the country of departure. We knew where to go, where we had our spare documents. I don't think that in our case, if we had even tried to do it, we would have been able to do it. It was already too late when we realized that something strange was happening around us. We began to suspect, already seriously suspect, that something was happening around us already literally a few days before the arrest. We had a car taken away for one day under such a far-fetched pretext because, well, apparently it was necessary to install equipment there, of course, to monitor our movement. We must pay tribute to them behaving very carefully, understanding that if they start acting well, somehow more actively, we will notice it. This is where the game was played by professionals against professionals, and if they had done such stupid things a little earlier, perhaps we would have made some attempts to leave or somehow escape from it all. What does an American interrogation look like? In our case, the American interrogation did not look very scary and threatening in general. It was quite respectful. Here, too, probably played the fact that they understood that they were talking to professional people, well, about as if we were talking to a career intelligence officer from the United States. Therefore, the first interrogation, of course, was conducted as an accusation. They wanted to show that they knew everything. We understood that we shouldn't say nothing. We refused, but I immediately refused to talk and demanded a lawyer. In general, everything was quite correct, but with the exception of the manner itself. Of course, you had to be in handcuffs, shackles. You were not left alone for a minute. Even in the ladies' room, they escorted me and followed me there. So this was a rather serious situation from the point of view of formalities and from the point of view of the conversation itself. In general, everything was quite correct. Later in prison, of course, it was more difficult, because the situation there was also a heavy solitary cell. In order to go somewhere, for example, to meet with a lawyer, you had to go through a lot of checks, where you were checked from head to toe. You had to undress to show everything. Of course, prison clothes were their huge shoes without laces. It was impossible to have hot drinks in solitary confinement, and food for you it was transmitted through such a small window that opened. A few weeks, and suddenly the lawyer appears accompanied by our Russian diplomat. I have a meeting in prison for a date, and in general, they say that I will be free soon.
On the tarmac of the Vienna airport, two planes stand side by side. TV cameras filming the finale of the spy story record how a group of people descend the ramp, get into a black minivan, and drive to an American plane. Then the minivan returns, and another group, more numerous, gets on board the Russian liner. Immediately after that, the airliners taxi to the runway and take turns soaring into the sky.
In Vienna,
наш
our
самолет
plane
приземлился
landed at the same
одновременно
time
с
as
другим
another plane
самолетом,
that
который
arrived
прибыл в
from
Москву.
Moscow. There were
Мы
4 of our
находились
fellow
четверо
citizens in it, who were
наших
just called
сограждан,
Americans for
которые
exchange.
как раз были названы американцами для обмена.
They
Они
received them in
получили их в
exchange.
обмен,
We were
и
returned
мы
to our
были
homeland.
возвращены на
It's
родину. Что
interesting that in
интересно, мы
25
полностью за
years,
25
we
лет
completely
вышли
fell out of
от
the cultural background of
культурного
our
фона
country,
нашей страны
and we did not know
и
either
мы не
modern
знали ни
singers or
современных
modern
певцов, ни
actors or
современных
films
актеров,
that were
ни
discussed
фильмы,
and were
которые
known.
обсуждались и были известны.
The
Если
songs of Grigory
Григорий
Leps, for
Лепс, например,
example, were
Глаз,
generally
говорит,
unknown to
в
us.
общем-то,
A glass of
неизвестные звуки
vodka on the
водки на
table.
столе.
It
Это
was,
вообще,
of
конечно,
course,
был
a
для
discovery
нас
for
открытие.
us. Friends
Друзей
had to be
нужно было
conquered again
снова
and
завоевывать,
searched for
снова
again.
искать.
It
На
also
это
took
тоже
some
ушло какое-то
time.
время.
We
Мы понимали, что
realized
мы
that we
должны
had to surround ourselves
окружить
with
себя
people with
людьми, с
whom we
которыми
were
нам
interested.
интересно.
And we
И
did
мы это
it,
проделали
and
уже
already
имея
having
опыт, наверное,
experience,
внедрения в
probably,
другие
of
общества.
implementation in
Опять
other
же, помогло то,
societies.
что мы
It
начали
helped again
работать,
that we
мы влились
started
в
working.
коллективы.
We joined
Я
teams.
начала
I
работать в
started
компании
working at
«Норильский никель»,
Norilsk
где я
Nickel,
работаю до
where
сих
I
пор.
still work,
И это
and it helped
помогло
me find a
мне
team of
обрести
people around
коллектив
me. The
людей
cigar
вокруг
club
меня.
was one of
Сигарный
the
клуб был
places
одним
where
из
we could say
мест,
very
где мы,
quickly met many
можно
interesting
сказать,
people
очень
now,
быстро
of course.
познакомились
Some time has
со
passed when
многими
we got used to
интереснейшими
it. And
людьми.
finally, we have already
Сейчас,
got the
конечно,
Russian
прошло уже
language on
определенное
first
время, как-то,
place,
когда
but
мы
sometimes
вжились,
we
и
still switch to
наконец-то уже
English.
русский
Because
язык у
it's
нас
easier to
встал
discuss some
на
topics in
первое
English,
место.
well,
Но
as
иногда
for
мы все
American
равно переходим на
politics,
английский,
for
потому
example,
что
or
так легче. Легче
geopolitics.
какую-то
Yes, we
тематику
always
нам
have such a tendency
обсудить
to
на
switch to
английском языке,
English.
ну, то, что
And
касается
if we
американской
talk about
политики,
some,
например,
say,
или
cooking some French
геополитики, да,
dishes, we
всегда
can speak French.
ну, такая тенденция у нас переходить на английский язык. А если мы говорим о некоторых, скажем, кулинарии, да, какие-то блюда французские, мы можем по-французски говорить.
How have your sons adapted to you? The sons
Сыновья
adapted to
адаптировались
Russia
к России
normally,
нормально,
that
то есть
is,
они
they
наконец увидели
finally saw the
настоящую
real
Россию
Russia
и увидели,
and
что
saw
люди
that
не
people are
такие
not all
все
bad, but there are a
плохие,
lot of
а есть
sincere,
очень
beautiful
много
people.
душевных,
They were
прекрасных
very
людей. Их
impressed by
очень
the beauty of
поразила
our
красота
girls,
наших
and they have
девушек.
learned the Russian
И
language, of
они
course,
выучив
and
русский язык,
already
конечно,
understand the
уже и
culture
понимают и
and our
культуру, и
essence.
нашу сущность,
Criticize something that we do not always comply
критикуют
with the laws.
то,
We
что мы
always we are trying
не
to
всегда
circumvent the
выполняем
rules
законы,
in
мы все
some way
стремимся
and
обойти
find some
каким-то образом
extraordinary
правила и
solutions.
найти
But in
какие-то
general, they are normally
неординарные решения.
integrated.
Но
They
в
speak
целом они
Russian
нормально
and they
встроились,
live and
они
work
говорят
quietly in
по-русски, и
Russia.
они спокойно живут и работают в России.
Of
По
course,
своей
we
работе,
miss our
конечно,
work.
мы skучаем.
We
Мы считаем,
believe that,
что,
in
в
general,
общем-то,
our well,
наша,
such a conscious life
такая
was spent in
особая жизнь прошла в
intelligence.
разведке.
And of
Конечно, нам
course,
было бы
it would be
интересно
interesting for
продолжить как
us to
можно
continue
дольше
our
нашу
career as
карьеру. К
long as
сожалению, она
possible.
оборвалась,
Unfortunately, it ended,
но
but
время от
from
времени
time
мы
to
думаем, что мы
time,
могли бы
we think that we
и
could
сейчас
benefit
принести
now if
пользу,
we
если бы мы
stayed there
остались
and
там и
worked.
работали, и были
And
до
we're
сих
still
пор
active scouts.